Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will discuss the United States' decision to rename its Indo-Pacific Military Command and what this means for Taiwan and its partners. Then we will look into who really benefits from Taiwan's economic boom and why this question carries serious risks. But first, let's start with our guests. The United States have announced that the US Indo-Pacific Command, or US INDOPACOM, would restore, as they say, its previous name, the US Pacific Command, or USPACOM. The official statement says the command was originally established in 47 as USPACOM for more than 70 years. It is the oldest and largest American Unified Combatant Command, and the name has been changed on two occasions a few years ago, I believe in 2018, to INDOPAC and now back to Pacific. So what does it mean? Is it important or not? Is it a big change or not? We're going to discuss this with Aadil, Brar and Ronan Fu. Aadil and Ronan, hello and welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, Julie.
I would kindly ask you both gentlemen to introduce yourself for our listeners.
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm Ronan Fu. I'm an assistant research fellow here in the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica.
Hi, I'm Aadil Brar. I'm an independent journalist and geopolitical analyst based in Taipei.
Thank you very much. And for a start, let's introduce our listeners to what exactly we are talking about. We are talking about a US command, the Pacific Command, known until recently as Indo-Pacific Command, and before that as Pacific Command. So what exactly is a command and what is this one in particular? If we can just have a general introduction, maybe Ronan, you want to start?
Okay, so basically, it's the oldest and largest U.S. combatant command, headquartered in Hawaii, roughly like 375,000 personnel. Is about like 52% of the Earth's surface, led by basically Admiral Paparo. So, for example, if this command would run any Taiwan contingency, including, for example, Paparo's hellscape concept. So today, I guess we are going to talk about the game changed.
Yes, indeed. Adil, do you also want to give your insights on what this command is?
This command has a very critical role across Pacific, and it has an expanding remit. Why in 2018 Donald Trump decided in his first term to change the name from PACOM to INDOPACOM was to emphasize the role of Pacific Command as a command that projects power across Pacific. But increasingly, the US administration at that time saw that there's a need to connect the Indo-Pacific region with Pacific Command because US wanted to project power beyond just the limits of the Pacific that end with Taiwan, going beyond into Singapore and further into the Indian Ocean. And that was a strategic logic of why this command was called Indo-Pacific Command in 2018, because the Trump administration at that point saw the need to link these two theaters as being intricately tied together, and the primary reason behind that being the strategic challenge posed by China. The first Trump administration saw China as the main adversary. That remains the case in the second term, but what we have seen as a change is that the overall tone of the administration has changed from taking on China as an adversary. Rather, now there is a focus on maybe engaging with China to an extent, maybe becoming more open to ideas that China might have to offer, but at the same time, remaining open to competition while also challenging China where it needs to.
So we are here talking about a part of the US military apparatus, to make it very plain and simple, that is in charge of military presence in this part of the world. And what I'm hearing here is that it was called the Pacific Command for a very long time until Donald Trump changed it to Indo-Pacific. And now it is the Trump administration that is changing it again. Ronan, what is your view on why is this name being changed?
I guess we can name two overlapping drivers. So the first basically is on the symbolic side. So I would see this as a part of Hexas heritage rebranding alongside Department of War, and for example, the restored Fort Bragg. And second, I think also carries some strategic meaning. I think right now the 2026 national defense strategy actually puts homeland defense first. And for example, they frame the US now as a Pacific power. So in a way, dropping into signals that the Indian Ocean for the United States, for its national interest, is secondary. And Pacific, or to be more precise, perhaps the Taiwan Strait is the decisive theater. And for example, as Shangri-La, Hexas actually laid India last. So to me, I think so. On the one hand, it's symbolic, but if we talk about the substances, I think it signifies like a reorientation of the focus that the United States is trying to pay attention to.
I echo some of the points that Ronan has mentioned. I think there is a re-emphasis on Pacific, and there is an interest in keeping Indo part of the Indo-Pacific in a different category, and that's partly because the US was getting stretched out one more time. With the second Trump administration, there is an interest to reconfigure its strategic logic behind why the US acts in the way it does in the Pacific by not just cobbling together these theaters into one single, broad region. And the other logic that I will add to what Ronan was saying is that CENTCOM, the Central Command, which takes care of the Middle East, has been fighting excessively in the Iran theater. There's been conflict ongoing. And so these two commands always have a tension building up, the Indo-Pacific Command as well as the CENTCOM. And they have overlapping remit in the Indian Ocean, especially regarding the US base at Diego Garcia. And I feel this has been discussed in the strategic, community that maybe one more time, the administration wants to make sure that CENTCOM doesn't get shrunk into this small space, that they also have the ability to operate in the Middle East and the Indian Ocean in a way that they need to protect the US assets in the region. So, and the second point about India's role, India was a bet that the US made in the first Trump administration, hoping that India can become a counterweight to China. And I think India has not delivered on some of the promises it made at that point, partly because India has its own strategic autonomy to maintain its own strategic logic. The tensions that India and China had going back to the 2020 clashes in Galwan, that kind of resolved in a certain way, and India doesn't see the need to push that logic of countering China. And it sees that US has also shifted its language under the second administration of Trump. So that is why the whole kind of logic behind having India and some of the allies in the region to counter China has petered out and hasn't really delivered the promises that many saw it would strategically in the first term. So there is a new reconfiguring of the command, and I think that will actually help the US focus more on what is on the cards, and that is essentially Taiwan and protecting Taiwan.
So there are a lot of things to unpack and a lot of questions that I want to ask after listening to what you both said. But first, let's clarify this. What does it change in practice, especially for Taiwan? Because some argue, we hear a lot of noise about this, some noise that this is a dramatic change, others that it's just a name change. So what do you think about this? What does it change for Taiwan, if anything?
I guess my take is that, this kind of shift cuts both ways. So let me offer a more optimistic view or a read of the entire change. So the optimistic read is that concentrating on the first island chain channels resources toward exactly Taiwan's fight. And so basically, it reflects, Paparo's posture that, the United States need to focus on the strategic competition against China, and the United States needs to make sure that, for example, the status quo across the Taiwan Strait won't be changed unilaterally, let alone using forces. But I can also provide a somewhat pessimistic read, which is, it represents the U.S. retrenchment idea or retrenchment is sending a retrenchment signal that the United States is reluctant to fight far from home. And some people may argue that it lands right after the May Trump-Xi visit, where Trump, in some way, some people will claim that Trump reaffirmed strategic ambiguity, so called the Taiwan arms package or negotiating chip, if you will. So basically, my read is that you can have either an optimistic or a very pessimistic way. I think that the truth lies somewhere in between. It definitely shows a reorientation or try to set the focus to Pacific, that's for sure. But Taiwan also need to deal with the fact that Trump administration is a transactional administration. They usually want to make sure that unless their allies pay, or unless their allies shoulder, the burden that they have to shoulder, otherwise the United States is not going to, put extra effort to, for example, to reassure or even to come to any allies' rescue. So that is also a danger facing Taiwan.
I personally feel that the answer is somewhere in the middle. I think that the Trump administration is trying to send a message that they don't want to counter China in every domain. If you remember, and I wrote an article recently for Taipei Times, bringing attention to how the context of when the Indo-Pacific Command, the name change was announced in 2018, is exactly when around that time there was one of the Chinese. There's an individual named Meng Wanzhou, who is daughter of the founder of Huawei. She was arrested in Canada. At that point, this arrest was seen as a message to the rest of the world that US will be countering China in every sphere. And I think that logic, which drives from the first administration, has changed a little bit in the second administration, is that we need to counter China. We need to challenge China where possible, but we cannot be so stretched out that we are countering China in every single domain, because we need to refocus on there's new emerging challenges with AI, with semiconductor industry. And so therefore, the renaming might sound symbolic, but I think it's a reset in terms of becoming more focused on where you need to have your attention at the moment. And that may sound somewhat of a positive read of what it means for Taiwan, but I think the attention span of this administration can shift very fast. So at least for now, the logic, the way I see it, is to focus on certain areas that require immediate attention, whether it is supplying weapons to allies in the region who could help Taiwan to build resources in the region that can help Taiwan during a contingency. So I see it as a refocus, as a trying to kind of cut out the losses where possible and try to focus on things that are require more attention at the moment.
So there is something that both of you have touched on several times, is the fact that the United States is now busy also with another part of the world, with the conflict in Iran. So to which extent does it play a role? Can we come back on this and go deeper into this? To which extent is this also a consequence of the war in Iran?
Yeah, I think it definitely, accounts for at least partially, or part of the reset, or rebranding or rename, if you will. And so I want to echo Adil that it definitely shows that United States has came to realization that the resources and the attention is limited. So you really have to make sure that you prioritize items that have to be prioritized. Right now, what happened in Iran, what happened in the Middle East for Trump is like a distraction from something that they should have, focused fully on, which is China, right? So I think Iran basically signifies, a factor that basically is even can be seen as like a wake-up call for the United States to say, okay, so listen, we got involved in this event, but we still have to be very sure that, the key focus should be and always should be on China, right? So I think, Iran plays such a role in that kind of rebranding.
My take is slightly similar, but different in a way that the US feels stretched out, in terms of supplying weapons. There's stories coming out just recently reporting by FT where we got to know that US is struggling to replenish some of the missiles that they've used in the Middle East during the war. And that partly plays into why the 14 billion of the package, the defense package that was supposed to be delivered to Taiwan has not been delivered, is because US has spent resources at a speed that are hard to replenish in the short term. So they're struggling to supply weapon systems to not just Taiwan, but also Japan and some of the allies in the region. And therefore, they need to be more agile with the way they act. And that's partly because of the mistakes that have been made in the Middle East. There might have been a strategic logic to get involved in Iran, and we can see how that's going. Despite the discussion about solving the dispute through negotiations, we are still kind of hearing that the talks are ongoing. There doesn't seem to be any solution, and maybe the US gets pulled in one more time. So this US gets distracted quite often, between the Asian theater and Middle East, and we are one more time seeing that kind of distraction happening. So somewhere along the line, the US knows that if they lose the Pacific, that is a major strategic blunder for the strategic community and US's future, and that is where US's future lies. And we've seen throughout history the US power projection in the Pacific is what has brought about a kind of hegemony from the US in most of the world, and that needs to be preserved. And losing that key theater to China, if China is able to project power into Pacific, beyond Taiwan, near New Zealand, Australia, that would be a major blunder. So US at the moment is distracted between these two theaters, but the rebranding on the surface looks very symbolic, but I think there is a lot going on under the surface that we will only get to see in the coming months and understand if what happens with the the weapon systems that US has spent in the Middle East, can they replenish them and can they supply the allies?
Thank you. There is something else that I would like to go deeper with both of you. It's the role of India on this, because if I understand well what you're explaining, the shift a few years ago, the change in name a few years ago, calling the command Indo-Pacific Command, was also a gesture towards India. And now, of course, it's moving away from India, which I think Aadil said, like India kind of maybe disappointed a bit the United States. But I mean, then again, India was always an unaligned country. It was never going to be entirely on one side or the other. And besides, its feud with China is long-standing. So regardless of whatever names the United States give to any command, India will always have its own strategic autonomy. So it's a bit surprising that they were believing this in the first place. So perhaps if you can tell us more about what was India's role in all of this.
I think when US decided to change the name to Indo-Pacific Command, the logic was having India involved in a lot of these exercises in the region. So an institution that kind of emerged along lines of when Indo-Pacific Command was announced is Quad. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue has been around for some time, and if you want to understand how India and its own interests are at now, kind of at the moment, they're not aligned with the US, is you need to look at Quad more closely, how some of the initiatives under Quad have not delivered, because the remit of this quadrilateral security dialogue has gone from security into domains which are more strategic. So drawing that distinction between security and strategy has been difficult, because I think the expectations were exaggerated beyond a certain point. India did participate in a lot of the exercises in the Indian Ocean region and Pacific. It was part of the Quad, the collective security exercise, naval exercises, and India did pull into these and learned a lot, operationally. Both sides, US and India, including Japan, and some of the other allies, have worked together. But what has happened is, I think the expectations were exaggerated to a point that India was never going to fully integrate into the defense, industry mechanism, or the kind of alliance building that US has. It always stands out. But what India instead found is it directly went to China to resolve its disputes that it had ongoing in 2020, since 2020. So that actually delivered and helped India calm down tensions because India was spending a lot on defense at the border. It still is spending a lot more money, but it found that actually going to China to talk to resolve tension was more fruitful than aligning with the US to counter China, because US was getting distracted. And so it goes both ways. It's a story that will be written in the future, how both sides had somewhat of exaggerated expectations from each other and they were not able to deliver. And that partly goes into how both sides view the world and the values they assign to their place in the world. And the expectations never really matched in that sense. And I think that is where India lost out on becoming a close ally because of its own reasons.
If I may, I want to actually go back to what it means for Taiwan after all the discussion we have, because I really want to maybe just get it straight so that people actually won't uh, be panic or be overly optimistic about the renaming. Yeah, so I just want to get it straight that at the end of the day, the rename is symbolic and near costless. So we really have to basically rely on the real tales to see, what Taiwan ought to do and what is the substance when it comes to the U.S.-Taiwan relations. I think the real tales are the following, and they are very concrete, not very nominal. First, so whether Washington delivers the arms package, that's number one. And number two, we also have to examine how the 2027 NDAA funds the Pacific Deterrence Initiatives. So that basically will counts down, how Washington managed, these two items. Otherwise, the discussion on the rebranding and stuff, basically we're just talking about something that, contains no real cost associated with the defense war or Pentagon, if you will.
So thanks for clarifying that, because this is exactly what we want to diffuse, because it seems like the reaction to this change of name is exaggerated, and it's not to mean that it is something to disregard, because if it happened, it had to have a reason. But as far as Taiwan is concerned, indeed, we should not expect that there is a massive change about this. Adil, would you concur with this? Would you tell us more about this?
Yeah, I definitely agree on that point. And I think we should, the name change is definitely something interesting to look at, but then it will only be over the next few months when we see the moving parts of what has actually changed, what has actually been done. Even at the point when in 2018, the name change was announced from Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command, there was initially a lot of hype around what it means, what it doesn't mean. But then we saw certain moving parts of what had been done. The Quad actually became an organization that could communicate with each other. Certain great things came out. If you may remember, during COVID, Quad and some of the other allies were working together to supply COVID medicines. So there was certain cooperation that we saw happen. And in this case, over the coming months, if the US does end up, going back to the initial 14 billion package that was proposed and does fulfill some of these, defense deals that have been pending for some time, that is when we will see what has shifted and what has not shifted. And if there's a shift in the strategic logic vis-a-vis China, it's only then in the coming months we'll get to know if this is just a symbolic name change or there's more to it.
So let's look deeper into India and its relationship with Taiwan while we are at it, because this is coterminous with the topic. Uh, as we commented, India is a non-aligned country that has its own position vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the United States and even Russia. So what can we say about the state of affairs between Taiwan and India right now?
If I may, I think we need to look at how things have changed between India and China, and that is the microcosm within which India views relations with Taiwan. I'll point your attention to the new Indian ambassador who was Vikram Doraiswamy, who has moved to Beijing recently. He made a visit to Tibet, a very interesting development. China is usually circumspect and they don't allow these kind of visits to happen. There is a lot of scrutiny around, and Indian side always makes these requests to visit sensitive regions, especially the diplomats, and they're denied that access. But this time, there is a kind of confidence on both the sides that allowing this visit would be in their interests. So things have moved on from the 2020 tensions, and both sides are cooperating in a way which we have not seen in years, and that's largely to do with, I believe, that India found a way to resolve, or at least for now, resolve its tensions with China that was simmering at the border. And US, despite supplying a lot of intelligence towards countering China's, despite opening its doors to strategic assets like the MQ-9 Reaper drone, all of those things. But somewhere India feels that it has to go and talk to China to resolve tensions. And within that microcosm, the relations with Taiwan have also evolved. They have moved on from the initial goodwill that was there between India and Taiwan. There was a lot of cooperation. There is still cooperation, but the things have been pulled back. I broke a story last year about some of the Indian diplomats who are being trained in Taiwan. They're no longer here. These diplomats used to come to Taiwan, and this is only in recent years. This earlier Indian diplomats used to get trained in Beijing, but due to tensions between India and China, the training is for Chinese, was moved to Taiwan. But it once again has been moved back to Beijing and Hong Kong from my sources, and that's largely because there has been a strategic change in the way India and Taiwan engage and what is going on between India and China. India feels that maybe they need to stop this kind of activity of being so engaged with Taiwan and reset relations with China based on my understanding and the people I've spoken to. So this program was ended last year and the last batch is moving out now. So, and there has been, again, it's all about exaggerated expectations of what both sides can deliver. Things were said about India-Taiwan relations, but the delivery on those things has been limited, largely because the way Taiwan is within the umbrella of US security architecture versus India that moves between these circles. You know, it can talk to Russia, it can talk to China, but it can also talk to the US. And that is where things have not worked out because of the expectations and on both the sides ability to deliver on those. Similarly, India wanted to quote some of the semiconductor industry that has realistically not come to a fruition. The only company that kind of invested in India is PSMC, and they are not exactly investing their direct IP. It's mostly training that's been given from the Taiwan side. So there was a grand expectation of this relation evolving over the years, but I think we have hit the roadblock, and partly to do with both sides having their own interests, but partly to do with how things are going on and the geopolitics that we are under.
Thank you, Ronan. If I can ask you briefly to also give your opinion on Taiwan-India relations.
Yeah, so basically, we can talk about the India-Taiwan relations from three different angles. So let me start with the geopolitical and institutional ties. So, for starters, Taiwan's new southbound policy has result in stronger institutional ties. And for example, recently, Taiwan opened a new Taipei Economic and Cultural Center in Mumbai, right? So that basically signified a milestone, a new milestone. And it can be seen as like an institutional expansion. And we also see, some of the strategic balance played by New Delhi, which is, India continues to avoid formally endorsing Beijing's one China policy, right? So, on the one hand, you could clearly see that India doesn't really want to pick a side. in between United States and China. But at the same time, you can see that, New Delhi is playing somewhat cleverly, when it comes to like one China policy controversy. But what really define the current India-Taiwan relationship is actually coming from the two dimensions that I'm going to deliver. So the first basically is the economic and tech synergy. So what we have seen is the in terms of the trade, basically bilateral trade reached like a record high at 12.5 billion US dollars. So now what we can see is that Taiwan export tech components and India exports mineral fields and engineering goods. So it's like a win-win situation for both countries. And we can also see that Taiwan depends its role in India's technology ecosystem, in particular the semiconductor investment. So that's very huge and very important. And lastly is the labor and the human resources. So basically, we are going to see Indian migrant workers very soon in Taiwan's workplace. So this workforce agreement between Taiwan and India, basically it started from the prior memorandum of understanding, but right now what we have seen is a key development integrating Indian migrant workers into Taiwan's manufacturing and agriculture sectors, so that in Taiwan's labor shortage problem can be alleviated, thanks to Indian workers, and also it's also the case that we see a lot of Indian students in Taiwanese colleges, right? So you see the burgeoning education and cultural exchangement. So right now we see the education ties being expanded. Basically, right now you see hundreds of Indians. You even see hundreds of Indian scholars utilizing, Taiwanese MOFA fellowship, and they came to Taiwan to study the region and to study, for some of them study cross relations, and some of them actually care about Taiwan security or even the U.S. Taiwan China relations. So you see Indian students and Indian scholars trying to be immersed in this environment so that they can get to know Taiwan better. So overall, we see some growing, albeit limited, ties in terms of the geopolitical and institutional. It's growing, but it's still somewhat limited. But we see magnificent progress being made on the economic and tech and also labor and human resources front.
One last question to ask you. You are in a position to observe it, I believe. If you can just tell us briefly, what kind of reaction do you observe in Taiwan to this name change?
In Taiwan, I have observed that there are two sets of ideas that I'm seeing right now. There's one set of ideas that I come across in Taiwanese media is that US is abandoning Taiwan. And the other set of ideas that I was pointing towards is that maybe this refocus is actually good for Taiwan. So, and the first set of ideas is essentially informed by the recent visit by President Trump to China, where President Xi and Trump had detailed discussion, and there was certain language mirrored by President Trump, which would be something that would make President Xi very happy. This was regarding Taiwan. So both sides have good arguments, and the first set of ideas are actually backed by recent events. But I would say that we would need to wait to see what actually the name change means in the coming months and how resources are allocated to the theater, and that resource allocation, whether it's the weapons, whether it's people, how US engages with the allies beyond just the boundaries of Pacific and rest of South Asia and Southeast Asia, that would really tell you what's going on. So we'll have to wait and see. But these are the two debates, and they are somewhat on the extreme ends, and people don't have enough data to actually decide what is going on. So we'll have to wait and see.
Aadil, Brar, Ronan, Fu, thank you so much for being with us today and for these explanations.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Taiwan's economy has received lavish coverage in international media. The concept of the Silicon Shield and the explosion of Taiwan's stock exchange thanks to TSMC and other semiconductor companies have been widely discussed. But we are also starting to see reports on the other side of this boom. Many Taiwanese see little of that money in their daily lives. I talked to two other journalists who have observed this phenomenon as well and asked them about what they witnessed.
My name's Erin Hale. I'm a journalist based in Taiwan for the past 6 years, and I've been in Asia for like 10 years.
My Chinese name is Jia-hong, and I'm a senior researcher at Commonwealth magazine. My topic is the economy and finance, most focused on Taiwan and US.
Both have written about the same issue. Taiwan's semiconductor industry is getting richer, but it represents only a fraction of the population.
Recently, Taiwan GDP is expected to rise over $40,000 per capita, but most GDP are generated from the ICT industry. But only 10% of Taiwanese people are in this ICT industry, so most Taiwanese people cannot enjoy the growth of the GDP and economy.
So I observed, I think, a situation that would be familiar to anyone who lives here, which is that you see these really crazy statistics, in the newspaper or online about government publications about double-digit GDP growth, and that sounds really exciting. But if you're in Taipei, maybe not, in the fancier districts, but it doesn't really feel like a booming economy. If you've ever spent any time like in San Francisco, in the mid-aughts, I was in Canada during the oil boom. There can be this kind of like excitement in the air. And I don't know if it's that, Taiwan's a pretty low-key place, but you still don't really feel it here. So I was trying to figure out why that might be the case.
For many others, the situation is actually getting worse. The rise of a highly paid class of tech workers contributes to a higher cost of living, especially when it comes to housing. This contrasts with the past. Taiwan's prosperity was built on small and medium-sized companies that gave a much larger share of the population a chance.
Right now, the ICT industry is really strong, but I can't see any other industries that can grow and take the place of ICT industry. So I think the inequality will last for at least decade, but in the future, I really hope Taiwan can have other stronger industry to boost the economy to balance such inequality.
I knew a bit about Taiwan's economy already, which is that Taiwan historically, I think the best part and the greatest part of Taiwan is that it's dominated by SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So that means that Taiwan has gotten wealthy on sort of all these hundreds of thousands of companies working together. And what that means, I think, is that traditionally, everyone has done well. Maybe they haven't gotten as like ultra rich as say in the US or in Hong Kong, but it means that I feel like all of society is more equal. So I knew that. And then I was looking at how a lot of the wealth is concentrated in just this time versus say the last boom in the 70s and 80s. This time all the wealth is really concentrated in certain industries. And I looked at stuff like salary, like corporate profits. You can look at what is booming in terms of like export and import. Certain kinds of exports and imports are like way, way up versus something like, bicycles. And that's just very clear from the data. And then you talk to people anecdotally and they say, yeah, you can talk to people who are like, yes, my traditional, export company isn't doing so well because we've been hit by Trump's tariffs versus someone who works in the tech industry and they don't have to deal with any of those tariffs because carve-outs have been made.
Actually, such issue have lasted for decades, but in recent decades, it become more serious because in the era of the COVID, the Taiwan semiconductor start to boost, and recently Taiwan's economy is boosted by AI. So such inequality become more serious. The group with low income and low poverty there is atmosphere in Taiwan also called 躺平. It's the same in China. So most people, so some people in the some low income people in Taiwan feel they have no hope for the future. So they just live passively and reduce their expense. But if they expense less, the company can get less money. So it's not good for the other part of the economy. Taiwan's real estate rate is lower than other countries, but the issue of real estate in Taiwan is the price is really high. And so most young people in Taiwan get the real estate by inheritance and support from the family. Those who get the real estate by on their own is not really high.
Both Erin and Jia-hong had the opportunity to meet people who are good examples of the problem.
I spoke to this girl who worked on not the admin side, but she worked on the side of a tech company where they were doing something like finding office space or sort of more admin style work. And she said every day, she opens the homepage on her work computer, it pops up, and it's the company's corporate page and it shows the stock price. And so she can just see the stock price is going up every day. And that's very, it looks exciting on the homepage, but it doesn't affect her at all, right? Because her salary is normal. It's not pegged to that price. She's not an engineer. And then she doesn't have sort of the extra money to buy into the stock market. So that felt very like apt where she can see she's so close to it. She's even at one of these tech companies, but because she's not directly involved in the actual tech work, she's not really like reaping those benefits.
If we analyze the distribution of GDP from the ICT industry, we can find that the GDP for the employees are declining from about 50% 4 decades ago to about 20% today. That means even the employees in ICT industry get the proportion less than before. So the income from the ICT industry are brought to the stock market and boost the stock price. But most shareholders of ICT industry are the foreign investors and the wealth people in Taiwan. So the individual investor cannot get too much from the growth. That's what I observed in Taiwan's economy. There are two common solutions that Taiwanese people are purchasing. The first is invest in technology stocks. The second is to get into the ICT industry. But as for the nation, I think the government should try to boost other industries to solve this problem. Yeah, ICT is good, but they have to find a balance between them. ICT companies must invest in other ICT companies and the company in the supply chain. And most people in ICT industry get the money, but someone said they travel abroad frequently, so what they earn are spent out of Taiwan.
And the implications for Taiwan are very serious. Inequality damages the social fabric, and the damaged social fabric weakens the resilience that Taiwan needs to survive in a dangerous international context.
I think it's true because in the Taiwan social media, some people are said when China attacked Taiwan, they have to fight. But most people have to go to the battlefield are young people, and these people are the low income, so they have no incentive to fight for loss with properties. So there is a voice say that why should we fight? Because we fight for loss with properties, but we have no property. So such inequalities may reduce the incentive for the people to fight against China and protect Taiwan.
I would worry that Taiwan's economy and its stock market is just going all in on one industry. And that's always, generally speaking, pretty bad historically to only focus on one thing. Like, what if there is, an AI bubble burst? That would have a huge, cascading effect on Taiwan. So that's something I'm worried about. And then the other thing I'm worried about is what they call, Dutch disease, which is where it's a little bit more complicated than this, but it's where, the government is supporting one industry at the cost of all others. And I would really hope that Taiwan doesn't do that because it creates a lot of risks. And I don't think it's a very good idea from a social perspective to only support one kind of industry and like one kind of job, not just for economic reasons, but as a sense of like social and economic fairness, that's probably not a good idea. But as long as the AI boom in San Francisco and the US and elsewhere keeps buying all these chips, they're probably going to keep going with the program. So we'll see what happens there. I think a lot of economists in Taiwan are actually like pretty worried about the government just going a little too far in on AI support. And I just hope that, as someone who lives in Taiwan, I'm a little bit more personally invested. So I do hope to see a more diverse economic strategy, because I think one of the things that's really nice about Taiwan is that it is like a relatively equal society. You don't have these huge wealth gaps. As someone who lived in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia, I've experienced them, and they just really change the dynamic of a place. And I hope that the government will do enough to support all the industries, not just AI.
We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.